How's it going, everyone? This is Jeremy again with Commander Quantified with this week's episode, the Quantified Hot Topic, the trouble with treasures. If you like this content, you want to see more of it, support me on Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. Like and subscribe to my channel. Yeah, that's what's going to help me keep making content for you. This episode's unofficial sponsor is Visa gift cards because apparently cash just isn't good enough for some people. So let's start off with the basic necessity of what are treasures. I've been doing game design for something like 10 years now, and so I like to break things down into the base components of what they do, what they are, what their purpose is. These in particular are ritual effects that can be saved up. So they're a little bit weird. They don't really qualify with any other category of ramp. They're their own thing. Let's take a look at some of the cards. So Treasure Map is a 2-cost artifact. It says pay 1 to scry 1 and put a landmark counter on Treasure Map. Then if there are 3 or more landmark counters on it, remove those counters, transform Treasure Map, and create 3 colorless treasure artifact tokens with tap, sacrifice this artifact, and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Again, we're going to be just abbreviating that text as treasures from here out, if I remember to do so. So this one in particular, you're paying 2. You have to have 3 landmark counters on it, so you're paying an additional 3, so that's 5 total. But for that 5, you're going to get 3 temporary mana when it flips. And then on top of that, you get a land, so you're ramping 4, really. So this is kind of a weird one, but still a really good example of a treasure creator. So next, as far as like a ritual, we're going to look at Pyretic Ritual. This is a 1 and a red instant to add 3 red to your mana pool, so you're net positive 1 red mana. And that's exactly what these treasures do, right? So if we're talking about ritual effects, we're going to be looking at stuff that just temporarily adds mana. The thing that treasures do that rituals do not is that they can stay around and you can wait for them to be accumulated enough so that you can cast a larger spell than you would normally be able to cast. Lotus Petal does basically the same thing as a treasure. The biggest difference that I would point out here, because this I have seen on Twitter, is that Lotus Petal is recurable. So in a deck that can pull back artifacts for free from the graveyard, your Muldrothas, your Lurrus of the Dream Den decks, any of those kind of decks, Lotus Petal is going to be better than creating treasure tokens, just because it can be done every single turn or multiple times a turn. Alright, so let's talk about why treasures are good for Commander first before we start trashing on their treasures. They shore up weaknesses in colors that have less access to ramp. So in particular, your non-green colors, if you are running monocolored, need support. And the way to do that is to give them treasures. In particular, red and white have seen the most access to them other than green. Previously, if we were looking at white ramp, this is what we had, was Knight of the White Orchid. It is a white human knight creature 2/2 with first strike. When Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a plains card, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle. So this card relies on you being behind, which most of the white cards are going to. They play a lot of catch-up ramp. Same thing with Keeper of the Accord, which is a more recent printing, I believe, in Commander Legends. So that is what we had for land ramp previously. Now they've gone this direction with something like Smothering Tithe, which is an enchantment for 3 and a white. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 colorless. If that player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token. So what makes this particular strategy good is that it's creating additional permanence, so you can run artifact synergies with that. But I'm going to say that 9 times out of 10 people are not going to pay the 2 to stop you from getting one additional. When I am seeing this played in my play groups, Smothering Tithe is going to do work. It is also 4 mana, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is the top end of where you want any amount of ramp. So that would be something to consider. The new card Smuggler's Share, excellent. 2 and a white enchantment at the beginning of each end step. Draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn. Then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. So basically, this is a card that can get you ahead if your opponents are doing a lot of things. Or at least as kind of like we were talking about, getting you up to the level of the opponent that has the most. You will get up to them, you probably won't cap them. So Smuggler's Share, great card, play it. No reason not to. This is kind of where you want your ramp to be, is Smuggler's Share. On the opposite side of things, let's talk about red in particular. So previously we had mostly stuff like Mindstone if you wanted an untapped source. So that is a 2-cost artifact. It has tap, add colorless to your mana pool, or pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice and draw a card. So red did not have a lot of access to additional ramp sources without going into green. They pretty heavily relied on artifacts for a long time, or ritual effects. And as we have discussed, ritual effects are not actually ramp in the same way. Stormkiln Artist is a newer one. It is a 3 and a red creature dwarf shaman, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. It has Magecraft, which is whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, create a treasure token, and it is a 2/2. This card can get insane. It's very, very good. And it's caster copy, I apologize. So when you're talking about red ramp, if you're doing like Spellslinger, like Izzet, so blue-red instants and sorceries, this is like just top of the line. You can create multiple treasures each turn easily, especially if you're doing things like cantrips where you pay a mana and draw a card. New Capenna just released to us Goldhound, which is a 1-cost 1/1 artifact creature treasure dog. So treasure is the artifact type, dog is the creature type. It has first strike and menace, and sacrifice Goldhound to create a treasure token. So this particular card I think is going to enable like our 3-cost commanders a lot. Previously, I would say that the next best thing was the one that had Encore. It's a 1-cost, but it only does it when it dies. It's a goblin. Anyway, when it dies, it creates a treasure token. It has Encore, so you can make a copy for each opponent, and then it'll attack those opponents. And when it dies, because you have to sacrifice it, it'll create a treasure token for each of those opponents that it attacked. I think that's the next best thing we had prior to Goldhound in the 1-drop slot that's specifically for red, because obviously Sol Ring exists. So treasures are really good for shoring up weaknesses in colors that have less access to ramp. So then we have to ask the question, why in the world does green need treasures? They have pretty much everything else. They have card draw. They have ramp. They have removal for artifacts and enchantments. They have reasonable creature removal. They have regrowth effects. Why in the world does green also need treasures? So from a game design standpoint, I think that paving the way for green to be able to interact with artifact synergies is design space that hasn't been opened to this point, and I kind of understand that. At the same time, giving I was listening to EDH Rec earlier today. and they were talking about treasures as well. I think that green, the color of nature, having access to artifacts does not really make sense as far as like thematically. But opening the design space mechanically will eventually enhance the game as long as it doesn't get too out of control. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, where are treasures a problem? Because they obviously are. There's uproar on Twitter. The Magic community is like, why in the world does Bootlegger's Stash even exist? So the problem cards are things like when they can produce a large burst of advantage in a single turn. And I think that that's where you're actually going to find people complaining the most. Dockside Extortionist is like the absolute bane of a lot of people's lives right now. It's not as good in your casual deck pods, but it's still extraordinarily good later on in the game. There are combos you can do with it that go infinite. Yeah, it provides a large burst of advantage though in a single turn. Like that's what you're seeing with it, right? Same thing with Bootlegger Stash. So it is 5 and a green, an artifact. Lands you control have tap to create a treasure token. I can see this being really good in any control deck in particular, because what you're going to do is hold up your mana, and any mana that you didn't use, you're going to tap it and create a treasure token, because you can do that at instant speed, according to what this is saying right here. That part is concerning. I really wish it was activate this ability only at any time that you could play a sorcery spell. That would have really balanced it out a lot. But I understand that that's not something that they were wanting to do. You do end up... so if one of the primary looks that we get at Commander or Magic in general is the player who spends the most mana is the one that eventually wins the game, you actually don't net any mana on Bootlegger Stash. You are just storing it away like you would in, say, like Omnath Locus of Mana in particular, or Horizon Stone, something like that. Basically, you're storing it away. I think that the biggest issue is that the treasure tokens tap for mana of any color. Like, there are a lot of issues with this card, but I don't think that it's as big of a problem as people would believe. I'll talk about that in a minute. Just give it. Old Gnawbone is 5 green legendary creature dragon, flying 7/7. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, create that many treasure tokens. This is just crazy, because it will pay for itself. This is 100% actually factually ramp. It's crazy. I think that this was kind of not a design mistake, but they have so many instances where it'll read like whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to an opponent, create a treasure token. Like, it's limited that way, right? This is not. This says, oh, I'm going to hit you with this evasive creature I just played and create 7 treasure tokens. And that's at the bare minimum. Especially in a world where Finale of Devastation exists, I don't think that this was a great choice on the part of the designers. That's, again, opinion. I can see why they wanted to give a dragon treasures. Why'd it have to be in green? I see Gala Greeters being a problem. It is 1 and a green for a 1/1 elf druid with basically creature fall. So whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Put a 1/1 counter on Gala Greeters, create a tap treasure token, you gain 2 life. So basically every single turn you can create an additional treasure token off of this thing. And it doesn't cost you anything to do. You're just playing creatures like you normally would. Cards like this that just give you latent treasures in a color that already has good access to ramp is kind of sucky. And Tireless Provisioner is actually my top pick for the most problematic card that they've made. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So it is 2 and a green for a creature elf scout. It is a 3/2 with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token. So here's the deal. In the color that is the most focused on getting additional lands into play, now you're giving it treasures on top of that. This is the problem card. Like, forget the rest of them. Old Gnawbone costs 7 to cast, and then you have to swing with it. Tireless Provisioner, by the time you get to the point where you would be casting and swinging with Old Gnawbone, can already be 4 treasures per turn deep easily in a landfall deck. In a color that does not need that in any way, shape, or form. It would be much better if it was in red or white. I think that red in particular makes more sense to be the color of treasures because it's hoarding, it's dragons, it's goblins, it's all that other stuff. But yeah, what we're looking at here is cards that can provide bursts of advantage in a single turn. I do not have it on here, but Pitiless Plunderer would be another one that's a good example of that, because you can sack a bunch of creatures, they all come back as tokens, sack a bunch of creatures, you have 10 treasures. Revel in Riches, you wipe the board, you make a ton of tokens, which is just, Revel in Riches is much easier of a win con to get to than it used to be. So let's address the elephant in the room, which is the Bootlegger Stash. Most people are really upset about this particular card. But let's take a look at it using our 4 metrics, right? For utility, it's just ramp. If it's that, because you are tapping a land to create a treasure token, you are actually net neutral on mana. What it is doing is fixing your lands. The fact that you can save them over until the next turn does not mean that over the course of the game you've spent extra mana, but you are enabling yourself to spend more. Like we talked about, this is kind of a storage situation, like Omnath Locus of Mana or Horizon Stone. It is a high cost efficiency. It's a 6. You don't want a high score in efficiency. You want a very low one, kind of a golf situation there. In a color that already has access to so much ramp at the mana cost of 1 through 3, I don't think you see this played unless they are specifically trying to use it for the player is trying to use it for a combo, like we were talking about with Time Sieve not too long ago. It's an infinite. As long as you have 6 lands, you just go take infinite turns, make infinite mana, so you just win. And this particular card, like, it's 6 mana to get out, at which point in green you probably have 10 mana available, and at that point, why do you need a Bootlegger Stash? So I would probably end up cutting this from any deck that doesn't actually like need an artifact synergy. So like maybe I looked up on Scryfall and on Gatherer and tried to find a deck that this would be good in, and the only green stuff does not work really well with treasures. It doesn't have really any synergy. Just in green, this isn't that great of a card. In any other color, it'd be great. Synergy is 0. It just doesn't have the ability to do anything other than store. Opportunity is 4. That is a high score because you can do it on anybody's turn. We talked about playing it in control decks. That's actually what I think is the most going to be the most common application, is playing this and being able to say, okay, well, I can create treasure tokens for any mana that I didn't use, so on the next turns I can save it up. There is one particular commander that would really benefit from this, and that would be like Yeva, Nature's Herald, because you can just start flashing stuff in like crazy. The lands being able to make treasure tokens and kind of like bolster up. Yeah, I think that that's one of the better applications as well. So, if there are all these treasures going around thanks to New Capenna, what are we going to do about them? What is your reaction to that as a player? And my response is to play a few more hate cards. Even if it's just one more in each deck, a lot of these have multiple applications, so you're not just running it for treasures, you're running it for multiple artifacts or something different like that. So Vandal Blast is a great example. It's a sorcery for a single red, destroy target artifact you don't control, and then you can overload it. So for 4 and a red, you can destroy each artifact that you don't control, which either means that your opponents are going to have to sacrifice all their treasures in response and try and cast something at instant speed, or you just get rid of all their treasures. Newer card, Hidetsugu Consumes All is a enchantment saga for 1 black-red. The first stage, I'm not going to read all of them, is destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less, aka destroy all treasures. And it is useful because you can exile all graveyards as the second stage of the saga. So it's both early game mana rock hate and graveyard hate. The next one I'm going to look at is Culling Ritual. It's a new favorite of mine, so it is a sorcery for 2, a black and a green, and it's going to say destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less, and add black or green for each permanent destroyed this way. Well, your opponents are going to sack all their treasures in response to this if they're smart. But that means that you've gotten rid of all the treasures, plus any other stuff that's mana value 2 or less. My advice is run this in a deck that doesn't care about artifacts or early game ramp that way, but you are in green, so usually you're going to be running ramp that is land ramp or such. Collector Oof is another good one. So what we talked about was destruction first, so you can actually run destruction hate cards. You can run lockdown hate cards. Collector Oof is 1 and a green for a creature Oof. Activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. It does not say unless they're mana abilities, which is the key on here. It's a 2/2, but basically that says, you know, you are completely locked down. You can't use your treasures. You can have them if you want to, but you can't use any of their activated abilities. The next one we're going to look at is Stony Silence. It is basically the same thing as Collector Oof, but it's an enchantment for 1 and a white, so it's much harder to remove. Same thing, activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. And then we'll move to slowing effects. So Blind Obedience is an enchantment for 1 and a white. It has Extort, which I'm not going to read right now. But artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, so if they make treasures, they come in tapped, so you at least have a turn to stop that. And it's good in other applications. The fact that the creatures enter tapped make it really good in something like an aggressive strategy, because your opponents have less blockers. You also have Manglehorn, which is 2 and a green for a 2/2 beast. When Manglehorn enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact, and artifacts your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So same thing, artifacts enter tapped. You're slowing down ramp in a color that, you know, will do that without a problem. So what are our takeaways? Our takeaways from this hot button issue of treasures, that they're a needed addition to colors that have less access to ramp. Despite the outcome of what treasures were originally supposed to do versus what they're currently doing, they have done good things and are doing good things for your red and white color pie. Green already has ramp covered. You know, Bootlegger Stash, call it what you will. I probably wouldn't run it unless I'm running control or I need like huge amounts of mana because you're not actually net positive. And we can rebuild. There are plenty of ways to stop the treasure menace. Not the Phantom Menace, the treasure menace. That was also a mediocre movie. Not the worst of the Star Wars. Fight me. We have tools that we can use to stop them. And I think that we'll be okay. I think that this will be all right. So let's end off with our favorite flavor text at the moment. This is off of the Mystical Archive Chaos Warp. Be careful when handling old magical trinkets. You never know who they've been. Augusta Lord Holdeen. All right, with that, we'll end it off. Have a good day.